in the gold-drenched sunroom of the Rosewood Estate's private dining hall, where orchids bloomed from marble planters and crystal chandeliers spilled daylight like blessings, Eleanor and Harold Whitmore sat expecting the usual polished staff who knew their tea preferences better than their own children. But when the server approached their linen-draped table, Eleanor's hand froze mid-air, her breath catching not from age, but from recognition. The young woman wore the uniform of the help, but her eyes held a history Eleanor had buried decades ago. Harold blinked twice, as if memory were playing tricks in the morning light. She looked exactly like someone they had once failed to protect. The tea would be poured, but so would the truth. The sun filtered through glass panes 2 stories high, painting golden streaks across the polished floor of the Rosewood Estate's private dining sunroom, where the Whitmores, Eleanor and Harold, sat with the practiced grace of a couple who had spent a lifetime beneath chandeliers. Everything about the space gleamed, from the burnished silverware to the fine china that rested atop white linen embroidered with gold thread. Harp music drifted gently from the far corner, where a young woman played beneath a trellis of orchids, and outside the tall windows, fountains danced in marble basins, framed by rose bushes trimmed with obsessive precision. It was the kind of morning that was meant to be serene, familiar, comfortable. That was until the waitress approached. She wore the uniform of the estate dining staff, black and cream with a white collar buttoned neatly, a small notepad in her hand, her hair tucked into a clean bun. Her steps were careful, respectful, steady. But Eleanor Whitmore stopped breathing the moment the girl's face came fully into view. Her hand, which had been reaching for the teacup, froze mid-air. The porcelain trembled as she set it down, untouched. Her eyes fixed on the young woman, wide and searching, as if trying to unspool a memory that had been tightly wound for far too long. Harold, seated beside her, turned slightly to observe the cause of her stillness. His voice was soft, controlled, the way it had always been when speaking through tension. "Do you know her?" Eleanor did not answer at first. She merely nodded, faintly, barely visible. Her lips parted but unable to form the words that had already ignited, like dry leaves in her chest. The waitress smiled politely and placed 2 menus on the table. Her voice was gentle and warm, with the light crispness of youth. "Good morning. My name is Lila. I will be taking care of you today." The name hit Eleanor with the force of a forgotten storm. Lila. She had known that name once, or one very much like it. Her heartbeat faltered and caught, and somewhere in the quiet cathedral of her memory, a woman's voice echoed back from a garden full of laughter and lilies. Eleanor was no longer seated in a sunlit estate. She was years younger, standing beside a housekeeper who had meant far more than her title had ever suggested. The moment passed, or perhaps it stretched, but in that instant, the harmony of the morning shattered into 100 shimmering pieces. She looked at the young server again, truly looked, and saw the shape of a familiar jawline, the warmth in the eyes, the quiet intelligence that had once lived in someone she had failed. The sun still poured in, the harp still played, but everything inside Eleanor had changed. The girl standing before her was not a stranger. She was a reminder. And Eleanor knew without doubt that this morning would not end the way it had begun. The teacup slipped from Eleanor's fingers before she even felt it leave her hand, shattering against the saucer with a soft crack that seemed far louder than it should have in the serene hush of the sunroom. A few drops of Earl Grey splashed across the ivory tablecloth, the pale amber liquid staining the thread-like gold embroidery in delicate arcs. Lila moved quickly, her expression transforming from professional calm to genuine concern as she reached for the linen napkin at her waist. "I am so sorry, let me clean that right away." Her voice remained composed, but her hands moved with the anxious precision of someone who could not afford mistakes. Eleanor barely heard her. Her gaze had locked not on the spill, but on the name tag, clipped neatly to the girl's uniform. Wren. The letters were printed in small block type, unassuming, but they blazed in Eleanor's vision like a flare from the depths of a long-dormant memory. She did not speak right away. Her lips trembled as though forming the shape of a name was a physical effort. She leaned forward slightly, her hand trembling as she placed it gently on the edge of the table. "Wren, you are her child, aren't you?" Her voice was barely audible, not much more than breath given shape, but it carried all the weight of recognition and regret. Lila froze mid-motion, the linen napkin in her hand. The look in her eyes changed, just for a moment, from concern to confusion, then to something unreadable. She tilted her head slightly, her expression guarded now. "I'm sorry." Eleanor pulled her gaze away just long enough to glance at Harold, who was watching her with a seriousness he reserved for the rare occasions when Eleanor's world tilted. The room had not changed, but the atmosphere had. The harpist still played in the corner, the sunlight still danced across crystal glasses and polished silver, but the warmth of it all felt strangely artificial now, like a painting viewed from the wrong angle. Eleanor's fingers curled slightly around the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles pale. She could feel it stirring now. The memory of a woman who had once knelt beside a flower bed with soil-streaked gloves and a laugh that could smooth the edge off any hard day. Mara, that had been her name. Mara Wren, her housekeeper, her confidant, her friend. And then, one day, she had been gone, disgraced, erased, and Eleanor, too afraid or too complicit or too weak to speak the truth aloud, had let it happen. Now here was this girl, standing in her dining room like a question Eleanor had spent decades avoiding. A child with her mother's posture and eyes, and unknowingly, her legacy, Lila Wren. The name that cut through silks and silver and decades of silence like a blade. Eleanor could feel it in her chest now, rising like something holy or horrible. The past had not died. It had simply waited. And now it was asking to be heard. Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair gliding back with a soft scrape against the marble floor, the clatter far too harsh for the delicate grace of the room. She offered no explanation as she turned and walked away from the table, her pace slow but unsteady, her composure stretched thin beneath the weight pressing into her chest. The corridor she passed through shimmered with gilded frames and soft sconces, each step echoing in the silence she carried with her like an invisible burden. She pushed open the tall glass doors at the end of the hallway and stepped into the morning sun, the warmth of it washing over her in a wave of memory that made her knees weaken. The rose garden beyond the terrace was still kept in perfect bloom. The same winding paths she had once walked every afternoon with Mara at her side, laughter rising like birdsong as they discussed flowers and children and books they would never finish. Eleanor made her way to the center of the garden, where the oldest rose bushes still grew in a wide circle, their heavy blooms nodding gently in the breeze. She touched one absent-mindedly, a soft blush pink that Mara had always loved. Her fingers trembled against the petals as her mind filled with the image of Mara's face, framed in a navy scarf, the lines of quiet strength around her eyes, the gentle way she had always spoken Eleanor's name. They had shared confidences in this garden, secrets not even Harold knew. Mara had been more than staff, she had been sanctuary. And then she was gone, dismissed in disgrace, accused of stealing an heirloom brooch from Eleanor's late mother's collection. It had been Eleanor's mother-in-law who pressed the charge, who demanded Mara's immediate firing, who forbade Eleanor from defending her. There had been whispers, arguments behind closed doors, and in the end, silence. Mara had left quietly, too proud to beg and too wounded to fight. Eleanor had watched her go without a word. The memory burned. Her hands closed around the stem of the rose now, thorns biting into her palm. She had never searched for Mara, never asked what became of her, never tried to make it right. And now, here was this girl, Lila, Mara's daughter, serving tea in the very estate that had exiled her mother. Eleanor let out a long breath, a sound of something cracking open. Guilt pressed against her like heat. Not the kind that passes, but the kind that lingers, that scars. The garden seemed quieter than usual, the breeze still, as if the past itself were listening. 40 years of silence bloomed around her in thorn and blossom, and for the first time in decades, Eleanor did not look away. She stood amid the roses with the full weight of what she had done or failed to do, blooming painfully in her chest, and in the stillness she heard Mara's voice once more, soft as wind through petals, reminding her of a promise long broken and a debt still unpaid. Harold remained seated at the table long after Eleanor had disappeared into the garden, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his posture unmoved yet far from calm. The teacup sat untouched before him, the cooling liquid sending thin tendrils of steam into the air like a spirit rising. Lila returned moments later, napkin replaced, expression professionally neutral, but with a tightness around her mouth that betrayed the unease she carried. She collected the broken cup in silence, her fingers careful and quick. Harold watched her, not with the scrutiny of a man of wealth appraising staff, but with the sharpened awareness of someone trying to reconcile the present with the past. Her resemblance to Mara was unmistakable now that he knew to look for it the same high cheekbones, the same steady eyes that did not shrink under pressure, though they flickered now with caution. He waited until she set the last shard on her tray before speaking, his voice low, measured, and gentler than she expected. "Was your mother named Mara?" The question hung in the air like a suspended breath, polite but pointed, framed by decades of silence and buried guilt. Lila froze, one hand still on the tray, her body locked in that instant between instinct and memory. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came at first. Her eyes flicked to the empty chair where Eleanor had sat, then to Harold, reading him like one might read a stranger in a foreign place. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes, she raised me on her own. Said your names once, that's all I know." Her voice held no accusation, no demand, but it carried something far heavier distance, not the distance of miles but of years filled with unanswered questions. Harold gave a single nod, his hands folding more tightly, the skin across his knuckles pale. He had practiced this kind of conversation his entire life, the cordial inquiry wrapped in silk and civility, but it felt fragile now, like trying to hold water in a sieve. "I thought so." He didn't know what else to say, didn't know how to fill the canyon between her quiet acknowledgement and the long-ignored truth he and Eleanor had carried all this time. The room was unchanged in its elegance, the music still playing in its soft cascade, but the air between them felt dense. Something unspoken moved through the space, a recognition not yet welcomed, a history not yet claimed. Lila stood straighter, her professional mask slipping only slightly as she gave a courteous nod and turned to walk away, her tray balanced carefully as though the weight of memory were fragile and easily broken. Harold watched her go, his gaze not leaving her even after she disappeared through the service door. He reached for his cup, now lukewarm, and took a small sip, the bitterness sitting heavy on his tongue. The truth, it seemed, had arrived dressed in a server's uniform and wearing a name they had tried very hard to forget, and it was only just beginning to speak. Eleanor stepped back into the sunroom just as the late afternoon light began to tilt low across the floor, gilding the long windows with a soft amber hue that made the polished surfaces gleam like fire. Her hands were steady now, but her face was pale, the kind of pale that came not from fear, but from resolve born in the aftermath of reckoning. Harold looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable, though his eyes searched hers with a quiet intensity. She paused beside the table, her fingers grazing the back of the empty chair, the silence between them filled with everything she could not yet say. Then, softly, she sat down, smoothing her skirt with a gesture so precise it felt like a ritual. The harpist had left. The last of the guests were gone. The room, once filled with light conversation and the soft sounds of porcelain and cutlery, had gone still. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "We have to speak to her after her shift." Harold said nothing at first, but the question was in his posture, in the way his brow furrowed. Eleanor met his gaze and held it. "She deserves the truth, all of it." Her voice did not rise, but it carried a sharpness he recognized from a different life, a younger Eleanor, who had once fought for things before she learned to be quiet. The sun stretched long shadows across the floor now, falling like ribbons between the columns. Beyond the windows, the sky blushed faintly, the colors softening into lavender and gold, the hour when everything appears more beautiful and more fragile. Harold gave a single slow nod. "Then we will." Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, more out of ritual than thirst, and set it back down when she realized it had gone cold. Her eyes lingered on the white linen cloth, stained still from the morning's spill, a pale brown ring around the broken space where the china had once been. She thought of Mara in this room, not as a guest, never as a guest, but as the one who refilled glasses, who served meals, who disappeared before anyone remembered to say thank you. She thought of what silence had cost, not just her friend, but herself. Eleanor's decision sat in the air like a bell that had just been struck. It vibrated through the floorboards and down the halls of her memory, calling the past forward with every slow, reverberating echo. She would not let this girl leave the way her mother had, not with questions, not with shame. She stood again, slower this time, and walked toward the door that led deeper into the house, her steps sure, the sunset painting her shadow long behind her. There would be no more hiding. The truth had waited long enough, and Eleanor Whitmore, trembling but resolved, would finally face what she had allowed to be buried for far too long. The hallway outside the kitchen was lined with ancestral portraits, their oil-painted gazes following Eleanor as she made her way past them, the polished floors beneath her heels gleaming with the reflections of lamps just beginning to glow in the dusk. She waited quietly near the staff exit, standing straight though her bones ached, her hands clasped at her waist like she was preparing for confession. The dining staff began to trickle out one by one, offering polite nods as they passed, not stopping, not curious. But Lila slowed when she saw her face tightening slightly, the wariness in her eyes sharpening with every step. Eleanor spoke before she could turn away. "I would like to speak with you, in private. After your shift, in the drawing room. It will only take a few minutes." Her voice was careful, deliberate, the tone of a woman who had spent her life giving commands that sounded like invitations. Lila hesitated. Her arms were crossed loosely over her apron, and though she nodded slowly, Eleanor could feel the tension simmering behind her eyes. There was curiosity, yes, but also a cold guardedness, the instinct of someone who had grown up hearing only parts of a story and never the ending. Later that evening, the drawing room was lit with soft golden firelight, its high ceilings holding decades of silence between the ornate crown moldings. The space had always felt imposing to visitors, but tonight Eleanor had ordered the hearth lit and the curtains drawn, the lamps turned low, as if trying to soften the weight of the room's memory. Portraits stared down from the walls, men in dark suits, women in pearls, flanked by shelves lined with heirlooms, glass display cases, and silver-framed photographs. Lila entered cautiously, her steps quiet on the thick carpet, her uniform still crisp, but her hair slightly loosened from the long day. She stood near the doorway, not sitting, arms still crossed, as though bracing for something unpleasant. Eleanor rose from her place on the velvet settee, the fire casting flickers across her features, and gestured toward the seat across from her. "Please." Lila moved slowly, settling on the edge of the armchair like a guest in a home she did not yet trust. Harold was already there, standing near the fireplace with his hands behind his back, silent but present. Eleanor took a breath, felt the weight of it settle behind her ribs, and allowed the hush of the room to settle before she spoke. "Thank you for staying. There is something we need to tell you. Something about your mother." Lila's expression did not change, but her shoulders straightened slightly, her attention sharpened. The fire crackled between them, the air in the room shifted. The past, so carefully preserved in paintings and artifacts around them, was no longer content to stay mute. It was about to speak, and in that small, intimate circle of firelight and shadows, the truth began to stir. Eleanor sat forward on the settee, the fire casting gentle warmth against her hands as they folded in her lap, and for a long moment she simply looked at Lila with an expression that held both apology and awe, as if unsure whether the girl before her was a ghost returned or a mirror of the past. The silence stretched, but it did not break, and when Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was quiet, not weak, but heavy, with a tenderness rarely given room to breathe in a house like this. "Your mother was more than our housekeeper, more than staff. She was my closest friend. She was my sister in all but blood." Her gaze dropped to the floor, her next breath shuddered, and for the first time in decades, she let herself be small. "Mara was with me before Harold and I were even married. She came when I was still learning how to be someone's wife, in this house that wasn't mine yet. I trusted her more than I trusted myself. We spent nearly every afternoon in the rose garden talking about nothing and everything. She helped me choose wallpaper, and knew which days I wanted to cry before I said a word. She knew my heart. Eleanor paused, her voice hitching slightly, and she looked back up at Lila, whose expression had softened despite herself. I have never loved another woman the way I loved your mother, and I let something happen that I will regret for the rest of my life. Harold moved slightly beside the fire, but he said nothing. He, too, seemed caught in a memory. The room around them seemed to lean in, listening, the weight of its oil portraits and antique furnishings no longer just decoration, but witness to a moment that had waited far too long to arrive. Eleanor turned her head slightly toward the largest painting above the mantel, a sweeping portrait of the estate as it looked a century ago, all golden light and rolling hedges, unmarred by time or truth. When the accusation came about the missing brooch, I didn't believe it, not for a second, but my mother-in-law did, and my silence gave her permission to destroy Mara. I stood back and let her reputation be shattered. I thought I was powerless, that it was better not to make waves, but what I really was a coward. The last word came out cracked, like it had been locked away for far too long. Lila's brow furrowed, her arms still crossed, but her grip had loosened. She said, "You were kind," Lila murmured. "Once." She never spoke about the rest. The flicker in her voice betrayed a hope she had buried even deeper than her questions. Eleanor nodded slowly, her throat tight. I should have stood beside her. I didn't, and it cost her everything. She reached up and touched the small locket around her neck, fingers trembling. "And now you're here, in this house, where she was erased. You deserve to know why." The fire snapped softly as Eleanor leaned back into the velvet cushions, her eyes focused not on Lila, but on something far behind her, as if the flames themselves were replaying a scene she could never forget. The brooch was a gift from my husband's grandmother, a delicate thing, rubies set in a gold filigree that had belonged to someone important enough to matter. It disappeared during the winter ball one year. That same night, Mara had stayed late to help me dress for the event. She held that brooch in her hand, fastening it to my collar. I remember the way she smiled as she adjusted it. Hours later, it was gone. Eleanor's voice thinned, and in the morning, so was she. She reached for a glass of water on the nearby table, untouched until now, and took a slow sip, as if bracing for what came next. My father-in-law was the one who made the decision. He believed she had taken it. He said there were no other possibilities. But I knew better. I knew Mara, and I still said nothing. I didn't fight him. I didn't question him. I didn't even ask for time to understand. I let the lie win. The words dropped like stones into the silence, rippling outward with consequences too old to fix and too fresh to escape. Lila did not move at first, but the shift in her expression was unmistakable. The softness in her eyes hardened, her mouth tightened. "You knew she didn't do it, and you let them destroy her." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that filled the room like smoke. Eleanor looked at her now, truly looked, and the lines in her face deepened as if carved by the shame that had lived behind her eyes for 4 decades. I thought I was protecting the family. I thought it was better to let it pass than to make a scandal. But I see now that silence can be cruelty too. Lila stood, her arms unfolding as she paced once, slowly toward the edge of the hearth and back. So she vanished, not because she was guilty, but because you were silent. Eleanor didn't answer, and she didn't try to defend herself. The only sound was the fire breathing behind them, soft and steady. Lila shook her head, not in disbelief, but in the quiet, painful confirmation of every instinct she'd carried her entire life. She used to hold that brooch in her hand, Lila said bitterly. Not the real one, a replica she made out of beads and wire. She told me stories about it like it was magic, said it used to sit over the heart of a woman who had once stood up for the right thing. She said one day I would understand what that meant. She didn't talk about this place, but she never stopped wearing the apron. Lila looked at Eleanor now with a kind of distant sorrow, her voice frayed but firm. She lost everything here, and you let her walk out that door alone. Harold had remained quiet as the words between Eleanor and Lila unfolded like a wound being exposed to air for the first time, but now he stepped forward from his place near the fireplace, his face shadowed by flickering light that could not soften the heaviness set deep into his brow. He looked not at Eleanor and not at Lila at first, but at the fire itself, as if hoping the flames might offer him a cleaner version of the truth. "It was Henry," he said finally, his voice flat with the kind of honesty that bruises. "My brother. He had it, the brooch. We found it in one of his coat pockets 3 weeks after Mara was dismissed. He said nothing at first, claimed it had fallen there by mistake, but even he didn't believe that." Eleanor turned to him, the guilt already thick in her chest, but Harold continued before she could speak. "My father confronted him quietly. No punishment, no public apology. The excuse was that Henry was a boy, reckless, impulsive, not malicious. It was dealt with privately." Harold's mouth curved in the faintest semblance of a bitter smile. The brooch was returned to the family vault. The matter was closed, but never forgotten. Lila stood perfectly still, one hand clenching the edge of her chair, the color draining from her face in slow degrees. So she was thrown away to protect a boy's reputation. Eleanor looked at Harold, and Harold met her gaze with a helplessness that felt foreign to a man who had built empires and negotiated global contracts. "Our silence destroyed her life," he said. The words came without ceremony, stripped bare. They hung there in the space between them, heavy and final. The fireplace crackled softly behind him, the flames alive and restless, casting flickering shadows across the ornate mantel where photographs of children and grandchildren smiled forever in golden frames. But the warmth of the room could not compete with the chill that settled in the space where truth finally laid bare its edge. Lila's breath came slower now, deeper, her eyes searching Harold's face for some sign of deceit, some crack in the narrative that would let her hold on to doubt a little longer. But there was none. Everything in him said this was real, this was true, this was late. "I grew up thinking she had made a mistake that cost her everything," Lila said quietly. "But it wasn't her mistake. It was yours." Harold bowed his head slightly, not in surrender but in mourning. "I know." He looked up again. She was loyal. She never spoke a word to the press, never asked for compensation, never called us out. She simply vanished with her dignity and her daughter, and we buried the truth under convenience. The betrayal was no longer just a sin of the past. It was a legacy passed down, and now it stood in the firelight, demanding to be seen, demanding to be answered. Lila stood there a moment longer, silent, but no longer still. The quiet storm behind her eyes breaking through in the smallest of ways, a blink that lasted too long, a sharp breath drawn in too quickly, the trembling of her fingers barely visible as she gathered herself. The velvet chair she had occupied moments ago now seemed like a trap, its ornate carvings and gilded legs mocking the comfort she thought she had found when she first stepped into this room. She looked at Eleanor, then Harold, and something in her expression shifted, not anger, not grief, but the dull ache of clarity, the kind that pulls everything known into question. Her voice, when it came, was brittle, thin with restrained disbelief. "I used to think this place was magic. When I was little, I'd imagine it behind every story my mother never finished telling. I thought it was a fairy tale." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the oil portraits, the polished wood, the shelves of books arranged with care by people who never read them. "I thought maybe the silence meant it had all been too painful for her to remember. But now I see. She was protecting me from this. From you." Eleanor took a step forward, but Lila backed away before she could speak. "Don't! Please, not now!" Her voice broke slightly, not enough to shatter, but enough to sting. She moved toward the door slowly, deliberately, as though every step away from them was a step toward reclaiming her footing in a world that had just shifted beneath her. Her mother's name, her own name, the lineage she thought was lost or unimportant now tangled with a family that had built its fortune on stolen grace and quiet cruelty. The drawing room no longer felt elegant. It felt suffocating, heavy with apologies that had waited too long, with truths wrapped in velvet and sealed behind heirloom glass. She paused at the doorway, her back to them, the fire throwing her shadow tall against the paneled wall. "I don't know what hurts more, that you let it happen, or that you didn't even look for her." Not once. She didn't wait for a response. The door opened and closed with a soft click, and she was gone. The hallway swallowed the sound of her footsteps, and Eleanor remained rooted in place, arms hanging useless at her sides, eyes unfocused. Harold sank slowly into the chair she had left, his hands clasped together, elbows on knees, staring into the fire like it might undo what they had done. The room was silent except for the quiet hiss of wood splitting in the flames. The warmth of it no longer reached their skin. Outside, the last of the day faded from the tall windows, and with Lila's absence, it felt as though even the light had withdrawn. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, soft and solemn, and the sound echoed into the space she had left behind. The attic above the east wing was a place Eleanor rarely visited, a room reserved for the past in its rawest form, where dust-blanketed memories and sunlight came only in slanted slices through narrow windows streaked with time. The scent was thick with cedar and mothballs, the air unmoved by the comforts of the rest of the house. Here, no harp music played, no fire danced politely in a marble hearth, only silence, and the quiet creak of floorboards beneath her slippers as she moved between old trunks and forgotten furniture draped in linen. She had come searching for something she wasn't even sure existed, a photograph perhaps, or a journal, any remnant of Mara that hadn't been swallowed whole by decades of denial. Her fingers moved carefully over a row of labeled boxes until one caught her attention. Winter Ball, 1981. Her hands hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside were invitations, dried corsages, a brittle white glove, and beneath them a sealed envelope yellowed with age. Her name was written across the front in a familiar, looping hand. Eleanor. No last name, just Eleanor. The moment cracked open like a glass heart dropped to stone. She sat down on an old upholstered chair as the dust stirred around her like breath, and with trembling fingers opened the letter that had waited nearly half a lifetime to be read. To Eleanor, I forgive you, but I cannot forget you. Her throat tightened as the words leapt from the page, soft but certain, stained at the edges but sharp as needles. You were my friend, my truest, and when you turned away, it broke something in me that I've never managed to fix. But still, I do not hate you. I pity the silence you had to live inside. I hope it's kinder than the world I stepped into alone. Eleanor stopped reading. Her breath hitched. She pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes, and the first sob broke loose from her ribs like a long-held breath forced free. It was not elegant, it was not restrained. It was the grief of someone who had spent 40 years convincing herself she had no right to mourn what she allowed to be taken. The letter trembled in her grip, but she did not let it fall. Mara had written these words not to wound, but to release, and she had never sent them. Perhaps she thought it would not be read. Perhaps she believed Eleanor did not deserve it. But here it was, a key left under a mat no one had checked in decades. Forgiveness, not a pardon, but a bridge. The attic around her felt alive now with whispers, with fragments of time that swirled like dust motes in the quiet. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her lap, her eyes red, her chest hollowed by the weight of what had waited. It was too late to fix the past. But maybe, just maybe, not too late to honor it. The archive room was hidden behind a locked oak door in the Whitmore family library, accessible only by a brass key Harold had carried on his ring for over 40 years, its purpose long neglected. The door opened with a groan that echoed into the narrow hallway, revealing a room bathed in clinical light and silence, the kind that made every motion feel like intrusion. The walls were lined with filing cabinets arranged by decade, their handles worn smooth by time, and in the center stood a single metal desk, polished but soulless. There were no paintings here, no soft lamps, no warmth, only records, and the sterile hum of the fluorescent bulbs overhead. Harold entered with quiet determination, moving slowly but deliberately, the way he had approached every contract, every negotiation, except this time there was no profit to be gained, only truth to be unearthed. He went straight to the section labeled Human Resources, 1980s. His hands, though steady, trembled faintly at the joints as he pulled out the first drawer and began to sift through paper after paper, each document neatly labeled and catalogued in the style of his father's era. He found Mara's file tucked between two others, Mara Elaine Wren, hired 1976, position, domestic services. He sat at the desk and laid the folder before him, opening it with a care usually reserved for something sacred. Her performance reviews were exemplary. Notes in careful cursive described her as efficient, discreet, loyal. But then came the formal complaint, typed and cold, missing heirloom, alleged theft, termination authorized by Patriarch Whitmore. No formal investigation, no police report. Harold stared at the page for a long moment, then reached into another drawer, searching for the disciplinary records of that same year. What he found deepened the hollow in his chest. A memorandum, handwritten, from his father to the estate attorney, advising silence regarding the brooch's rediscovery in Henry's possession. The phrasing was clinical. Incident resolved internally. No further discussion warranted. Harold leaned back, the paper held in both hands, his eyes fixed on the damning loop of his father's signature. He remembered Henry's smug apology, the way he shrugged it off as a joke, a prank gone wrong, and he remembered not speaking up, not once. The room felt colder now. The years preserved in these files felt like ice, stacked and sealed. He gathered the documents carefully, assembling a slim folder of everything they had buried Mara's years of service, the falsified complaint, the sealed resolution. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. His hands tightened around the folder as he stood. This was no longer about guilt. It was about responsibility. He stepped out of the archive and closed the door behind him, the key heavier now than it had ever been. The truth had waited long enough, and soon the world beyond these quiet halls would see what this house had kept secret for too long. The knock came just after sundown, soft but steady, and Lila paused halfway through folding laundry on the worn couch that doubled as her bed when guests stayed over. The apartment was small, 2 rooms tucked above a florist's shop with honey-colored walls and hand-me-down furniture, but it was hers, and she had made it warm with the kind of details her mother taught her to care about. She crossed to the door cautiously, peered through the peephole, and her stomach dropped. Eleanor and Harold Whitmore stood in the hallway, dressed not for a gala or garden brunch, but in quiet clothes, plain wool coats, and tired expressions that didn't match the portraits she remembered from the estate walls. For a moment, Lila considered pretending she wasn't home, but something in Eleanor's face stopped her. She opened the door slowly, body angled just enough to keep the frame between them. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was flat, restrained, but not cold. Harold spoke first. "We came to apologize." Eleanor stepped forward, eyes searching Lila's for permission to continue, and to ask for something else. Not forgiveness. A conversation. Lila hesitated, then opened the door wider and gestured toward the small table near the kitchen, where a kettle still steamed from a forgotten boil. She didn't offer tea. She didn't sit. She watched them both as they stepped inside, standing awkwardly in a room too humble for their stature. Eleanor looked around, taking in the photographs on the wall, the quilt draped over the couch, the vase of wildflowers near the window. Everything here spoke of care, of survival, of love grown without luxury. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "We destroyed your mother's name, and we're here to restore it." Lila's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Harold placed a folder on the table, the same one he had carried out of the archive. "Inside are records. Your mother's employment. The false accusation. The internal memo admitting it was Henry who took the brooch. It was covered up, and we let it stay buried." Eleanor added, her voice raw. "This isn't some performance. We don't want your silence. We want your mother's name cleared, officially. We want the world to know who she was." Lila's breath caught, just for a moment. She walked to the table, opened the folder, and read in silence. Each page was a wound and a balm. The truth stung, but it also stitched. When she finally looked up, her voice was quieter. "What do you want from me?" Harold shook his head. "Nothing. But maybe you could help us tell it. Help us do it right." Lila sat down slowly, her hand resting on the papers. The weight of history shifted slightly, like something long stuck beginning to loosen. She didn't smile, but she didn't ask them to leave, and that was enough for a beginning. The next morning came with rain, soft and steady against the windows of Lila's apartment, the kind that blurred the world outside and made the quiet inside feel like shelter. Eleanor and Harold had returned, not unannounced this time, but by invitation, and now the three of them sat around the small wooden table that had once belonged to Mara herself, brought with her from a different life and refinished by hand when she had nothing else to restore. The room smelled of coffee and wood polish, and something unspoken hung in the space between them, like a thread waiting to be pulled. Eleanor opened a slim leather folder, its contents prepared with care. "This is a proposal," she said gently. "Not for you, for your mother." She unfolded a letter on crisp ivory paper and placed it in front of Lila. It was addressed to the board of the Whitmore Foundation, formally declaring Mara Wren innocent of all accusations, apologizing for the injustice done, and announcing the renaming of the Foundation's annual humanitarian award in her honor. Harold added another document, a trust fund, established in Mara's name, to be managed by Lila, intended to support education and housing for domestic workers and their families. And finally, Eleanor spoke again, this time more softly. "We would like to offer you a role on the board, as a voice we have never had, as the voice we should have listened to decades ago." Lila stared at the papers, each one a doorway she never expected to be invited through. Her fingers brushed the edge of the letter, and her breath caught in her throat. The formal language, the weight of official seal and signature, it all felt surreal, as if truth had been dressed in the same finery that had once silenced it. She looked up, eyes sharp with disbelief, and something deeper, grief, maybe, or the echo of pride she had learned to carry like armor. "You don't owe me a job." Her voice was steady. "You owe my mother her honor." Eleanor nodded. "We know. And this isn't charity. It's repair. What she built here, in us, in this house, in you, it deserves to be known. Not hidden, not whispered. Known." Lila didn't respond right away. She folded the letter once more, gently, and placed it back in the folder. She looked out the window for a long moment, the rain tracing lines down the glass like veins, then turned back to them. She saw not the towering figures of wealth and legacy she had once imagined, but two people trying to tear down a lie they had spent their lives living inside. "Maybe you can't undo what happened," she said finally, "but maybe you can make sure it never happens again." And that, she thought, might be enough for a beginning. Not an ending, a beginning. Spring came softly to the estate, the kind of spring that seemed to hold its breath between blossoms, where sunlight warmed the stone paths and the air carried the gentle hush of something sacred. On the eastern edge of the grounds, past the formal gardens and the curated topiary maze, a new space had been carved into the land, not symmetrical like the others, not rigid or ornamental, but quiet, organic, wild in its grace. Eleanor had chosen the spot herself, just beyond the old rose arbor where she and Mara once spent their afternoons in laughter and trust. Now, in its place, grew the memorial garden, a circle of heritage rose bushes in hues of cream, blush, and deep velvet red, each one selected for its resilience, its longevity, its beauty without pretense. At the center stood a slender marble column, understated and smooth, crowned not with a figure, but with an open bloom carved in fine detail. At its base, a bronze plaque was affixed with 4 simple words: "Truth blooms in time." Lila came alone on the day of its quiet unveiling, long after the gardeners had packed away their tools and the estate staff had returned indoors. She wore a plain blue dress and brought no flowers, There were enough already, but in her pocket she carried a single folded photograph of her mother in younger years, smiling in sunlight, apron dusted with flour, eyes full of the quiet certainty Lila had grown up leaning on. She walked the winding gravel path, her shoes crunching softly as she moved between the rows of blooming roses, their scent rich and familiar. She paused at the statue, kneeling not in ceremony but in memory, her fingers brushing the engraved plaque with a tenderness that needed no witness. She took out the photograph, pressed it to the cool marble, and whispered, "I told them." Her voice barely carried, lost almost instantly in the breeze, but she knew it reached the only ears that mattered. The wind stirred the petals around her feet, and for a moment it felt as though the garden sighed in response, not in sorrow, but in peace. Lila sat there for a while, not crying, not speaking, just breathing. She thought of the stories her mother never finished, the questions she had been too afraid to ask, the injustice that had silenced her for so long. But she also thought of the truth, now rooted here in soil and stone, not hidden but planted, blooming not in secrecy but in sunlight. She rose slowly, placed the photo inside the folds of her coat, and took one last look at the statue, the roses, the quiet. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. The legacy that once erased her mother had begun to rewrite itself, and in this garden, at least, Mara Wren would never be forgotten. The grand ballroom glittered with wealth and history, crystal chandeliers casting fractured light over a sea of gowns and tuxedos, the hum of polite conversation swirling beneath the soft strains of a string quartet. Waiters in white gloves moved like choreography through the room, serving champagne and canapé trays as laughter echoed against vaulted ceilings gilded with generations of legacy. The annual Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala had always been a spectacle, a pageant of influence where reputation gleamed as brightly as the diamond necklaces and polished cufflinks on display. But this year, beneath the elegance and music, something heavier pulsed beneath the surface. At precisely 8 o'clock, the music softened and the lights shifted toward the stage at the front of the room. Eleanor Whitmore stepped into the glow, no longer a passive icon of old wealth, but a woman on the edge of something irreversible. She stood behind the podium, her hands steady against the lacquered wood, her silver dress catching the light like water under moonlight. The room hushed with expectation. Her voice, when it came, trembled at first, but it did not falter. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight is not just a celebration of philanthropy, it is an acknowledgement of failure." She paused, eyes sweeping the ballroom. 40 years ago, a good woman was silenced by our cowardice. Her name was Mara Wren. She was not only an employee of this estate, she was my friend. She was wrongfully accused of theft, dismissed in disgrace, and abandoned by those who knew better. By me. The words landed like stones in water, rippling through the glittering crowd. Eleanor continued, her voice clearer now. "We have since uncovered records that prove her innocence, that show the accusation was false, that the true culprit was protected, and Mara was made to pay the price. I am here tonight to say her name, to tell the truth, and to begin, in the only way we can, to make it right." At the back of the room, Lila stood near the double doors, no longer hidden in shadow but lit by the stage lights that spilled across the parquet floor. She wore a simple black gown, her mother's locket around her neck, and for the first time, she was not an outsider looking in. She was witness to her mother's restoration. Eleanor looked toward her, voice softening. Tonight, we restore her voice. The room remained silent, stunned, reverent. Behind Eleanor, the screens meant for donor slides and award recognitions lit up with an image, a candid photograph of Mara Wren standing in a garden, laughing, wind lifting her hair, sunlight in her eyes. The applause began slowly, then rose like a tide, not triumphant but solemn, a sound that carried something deeper than admiration. It carried the weight of acknowledgement. In that moment, beneath chandeliers and decades of silence, the reckoning had arrived. Eleanor remained at the podium as the applause faded into a hushed expectancy, the kind that fills a room not with silence but with gravity. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into a small, velvet-lined box placed beside the lectern and withdrew the object that had, decades ago, shattered a life in silence. The brooch gleamed under the lights, a delicate piece of gold filigree shaped like a vine, inlaid with 3 small rubies that glinted like blood under the crystal glare. She held it up for the room to see, her hand unwavering, the jeweled accusation catching the breath of every witness present. "This," she said, her voice firm now, "is the brooch that was said to be stolen, the brooch that justified a lie, a dismissal, a silence that stretched across generations." Her gaze swept the room, past stunned socialites and frozen philanthropists, past raised glasses and tilted heads. "You see it now and think of tradition, of legacy, but for one woman it was the price of her dignity." She lowered the brooch to her palm, letting it rest there like a confession. This should never have been the cost of someone's life. The weight of the words landed heavier than the brooch itself. Press cameras began to flash from the rear of the ballroom, their lenses trained not on the sparkle of the jewelry, but on the woman holding it with the solemnity of an artifact. Murmurs rustled through the crowd as recognition bloomed. This wasn't a gesture, this was a declaration. Eleanor stepped down from the podium, still holding the brooch. She walked across the stage and descended the short set of stairs, the crowd parting instinctively as she moved toward a small glass display at the front of the room. Inside it, empty but prepared, was a plaque engraved with new words: "The Wren brooch, returned in honor. May truth outshine legacy." Eleanor opened the case herself and placed the brooch gently inside, sealing it not behind lock and key, but behind the transparency of acknowledgement. "This case will remain open to the public. The brooch will no longer reside in our family's vault. It belongs to the truth now, and it will stand here as a reminder of what silence steals." Lila stood still at the back of the room, hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes locked on the small glint of red and gold now preserved beneath glass. She didn't cry, but her breath came shallow, and the pressure in her chest eased, just slightly, like something old had been set down after far too long. The room remained suspended, a ballroom transformed into a courtroom, a museum, a sanctuary. And in the center of it all was not just a brooch, but a reckoning made visible, a lie rewritten, and a name finally rising. The ballroom was still holding its breath when Eleanor stepped aside from the podium and turned toward Lila, her eyes steady, her expression open, inviting. Lila hesitated only a moment before crossing the polished floor, the sound of her heels softened by the velvet hush that had fallen over the crowd. She moved with quiet purpose, not like someone seeking attention, but like someone finally answering a call that had waited too long. As she climbed the stage, the lights caught the gold locket at her throat, the one her mother had worn in silence for decades. When she reached the microphone, she looked out over the sea of faces, polished, curious, unsure, and her voice, when it came, was not loud but clear, strong in the way only truth can be. My mother was your servant. She folded towels in the east wing. She scrubbed silver in silence. She walked past these walls for years without being seen, but she lived like a queen in dignity. She never once bent her spine for your pity, and she never let me believe that her life had been small. The room remained utterly still, every sound swallowed by the force of her presence. I am her daughter. Her voice tightened just slightly, and then steadied, and today her name rises higher than ever. She paused, letting the words settle. You silenced her, but you did not break her. You buried her story, but you planted me. I was raised on her truth, and tonight I return it to her. There was no bitterness in her tone, only the calm fire of conviction, the grace of someone who had learned strength through restraint. Her gaze swept the room, and for the first time, the portraits along the ballroom walls seemed to recede into shadow, outshone by a legacy that had never been gilded, but had endured just the same. My mother once told me that dignity doesn't come from position, it comes from how you carry yourself when no one sees you. She carried herself with honor even when you looked away, even when it cost her everything. And still, she did not teach me to hate, she taught me to stand. And tonight, I stand here for her. At that, she reached into her coat and drew out a single white rose, the kind her mother used to tend in the estate gardens. She placed it at the base of the display, holding the brooch, her hand resting gently on the glass for a moment. The crowd began to rise, not with applause, not yet, but with reverence. A few rose to their feet, then more, until the entire room stood with her, bearing witness not to spectacle, but to the return of something sacred, dignity, truth, memory. And in that moment, Lila Wren was no longer the daughter of a servant, she was the keeper of her mother's voice, and the room listened. The morning after the gala, the world awoke to a name it had never known and a story it could not forget. Mara Wren. Her face captured in a black and white photograph taken long ago in the Whitmore Gardens graced the front pages of newspapers, bannered across news sites, and filtered through thousands of screens and voices. Headlines ranged from restrained to righteous. Legacy reckoned, the Whitmores uncover decades-old injustice, from silence to spotlight. Mara Wren's name restored. Servant no more, a woman the world forgot, remembered at last. On television, anchors spoke in measured tones, while behind them, footage from the gala played on loop, Eleanor standing at the podium with the brooch in hand, Harold solemn beside her, and Lila's quiet grace as she placed the single white rose beneath the glass. The story rippled outward, moving beyond the estate and its history. Social media filled with images of the memorial garden, the bronze plaque that read, "Truth blooms in time," and emotional quotes from Lila's speech that had already begun to circulate in classrooms, forums, and advocacy groups. People posted their own stories of housekeepers, caregivers, nannies, and cooks who had vanished from homes and memories without thanks or justice. The Whitmores' confession had thrown open a door, and others stepped forward through it. Former staff from estates across the country reached out with old pay stubs, termination letters, and memories long locked away. Injustice, it turned out, was not rare. It had simply been polished over. Eleanor and Harold found themselves at the center of the storm, praised by some for their bravery in revealing the truth, criticized by others for taking too long, for only speaking when the shame became inescapable. Think pieces emerged from every corner: redemption or reputation management, the cost of silence and the currency of legacy. When the powerful speak too late or just in time, Eleanor read them all. Every word. She kept clippings of the harshest critiques on her writing desk, not out of guilt alone, but as a reminder that healing did not erase harm. Harold, more private in his reflection, poured his energy into logistics, ensuring the trust in Mara's name was protected, funding new grants under Lila's oversight, and responding to messages from families who had suffered similar wrongs. But it was Lila who became the voice people followed. Invitations came in universities, panels, non-profits, human rights groups. She declined most of them, at least for now. Instead, she spent her days between the Foundation's boardroom and the rose garden that now bore her mother's name. Legacy, she understood now, was not something given. It was something built petal by petal, truth by truth. And the world, once deaf to Mara Wren's presence, had finally begun to listen. In the days that followed the public reckoning, while news crews lingered outside the estate gates and bouquets arrived in waves for Lila, Eleanor sat alone in the quiet of her study, the heavy oak doors closed, the drapes drawn just enough to let in the morning light. Before her lay a stack of thick stationery, cream-colored with the Whitmore crest embossed at the top, once a symbol of silence, now repurposed for truth. She dipped her pen in ink, not a fountain pen, not typed or dictated, but handwritten, slow and deliberate, her fingers shaking slightly with each word. She wrote not as a matriarch, nor as the face of a legacy, but as a woman unlearning the habits of privilege. The letter was short. It did not perform. It apologized without excuse. To those who serve this house, you are not the help. You are the heart, the lifeblood of these halls, the steady grace behind the doors we too often close without thought. For too long, we allowed ourselves to believe that silence was elegance, that separation was dignity. We were wrong. You are not beneath this house. You have held it up, and we see you now. We see you. Eleanor signed each letter by hand, no assistance, no digital signature. One by one, folded and sealed, the envelopes were addressed to every member of the staff, from the groundskeepers to the kitchen team, from the junior maid who had only been there a few months, to the butler who had given his entire career to the estate. The letters were delivered the following morning with breakfast trays and uniform packages, tucked quietly into pigeonholes and changing rooms, into coat pockets and glove drawers. At first, there was silence. A few opened them in solitude, blinking back disbelief. Some wept softly in laundry rooms, others folded them into wallets or pinned them behind mirrors, and slowly the atmosphere within the Whitmore estate shifted. The hush that once trailed behind staff footfalls began to lift, eye contact lingered longer, thank yous became conversations, the invisible became visible. A few days later, the head chef who had worked under 3 generations of Whitmores posted a framed copy of the letter in the kitchen. One housekeeper laminated hers and kept it in her locker. And for the first time in memory, the annual staff photo was taken on the grand staircase, with Lila in the center and Eleanor standing behind her, not in front. The house itself seemed to breathe differently. The culture that once dismissed Mara Wren now held space for her story to shape its future. Eleanor kept one final copy of the letter for herself, tucking it into the first page of Mara's personnel file, now restored, refiled, and never again to be forgotten. The garden was in full bloom, the roses spilling over their trellises in soft waves of pink, ivory, and crimson, their scent mingling with the warm breeze that danced through the estate like a long-awaited welcome. A string quartet played lightly under the canopy near the hedgerows, their music weaving through the sunlight like silk. The table was set beneath the arbor, where Mara once walked in quiet shadow, now adorned with linen, porcelain, and silver that shimmered in the open air. But today, Lila Wren did not arrive through the back path. She walked down the central stone steps in a pale blue dress, her hair soft around her shoulders, the same locket at her neck catching the sun as she moved. At her place at the center of the table sat a delicate china cup, already waiting, a chair pulled out for her by a footman with reverence, not duty. But it was Harold who stepped forward with the teapot in hand. With a slight bow, unpracticed but sincere, he poured the steaming tea into her cup, his hands steady, his silence respectful. A quiet smile touched the corner of Lila's lips as she looked at him, not with superiority but with acknowledgement, the kind reserved for equals who have walked through fire and chosen not to look away. "Thank you," she said simply. Harold nodded, then stepped back, letting the moment settle. Eleanor sat beside her, dressed in soft tones of cream, a small bouquet of garden-cut roses tucked into a vase near her plate. She said little, but her eyes never left Lila, not in control, not in guilt, but in awe of the woman who now moved through the space once denied to her mother. Around the table sat members of the foundation, former staff, and newly appointed advisors, all gathered not in obligation but in celebration. It was not a formal luncheon, it was a garden tea, the kind Mara used to describe in stories, always imagining herself on the other side of the tray. And now, her daughter was not the one who served, but the one who was honored. Birds flitted in the trees overhead, the sun shifted through the branches, and laughter, real, light, unguarded, rose from one end of the table. Lila leaned back slightly, sipping her tea, her eyes scanning the blooms her mother once tended, now thriving in full, unapologetic color. The estate was no longer a monument to silence. It was a garden of reckoning, of return, of reversal. And in that soft afternoon light, where music floated like memory and every teacup gleamed with purpose, the wound between what was and what could have been began to close. The small gallery wing of the estate had once displayed only oil paintings of ancestors, faded hunting tapestries, and relics of privilege too often mistaken for heritage. But now, one room had been remade. The air inside was still and reverent, the lighting soft and intentional, each exhibit curated not to boast, but to reveal. In the center stood a new glass case, modest in size but monumental in meaning. Eleanor stood before it alone, the morning light filtering through the tall windows, dust motes suspended like memory in the quiet. In her hand she held 2 rings, one, an heirloom from her family, passed down through generations of Whitmore brides, its delicate platinum band inlaid with pearls, the other, a plain gold wedding band, slightly worn at the edges, its surface smooth from years of wear. Mara's. She had found it tucked inside a velvet pouch hidden in the back of an old jewelry drawer, never discarded, only hidden. kept too close to forget and too painful to display. Now, Eleanor opened the glass case with a small key and laid both rings side by side on a white linen cloth, their metal catching the soft light above. No plaque separated them, no hierarchy marked their meaning. Only a single, engraved line beneath the case. 2 lives, 1 truth. She stepped back slowly, her hand resting for a moment on the edge of the display, her breath steady, her eyes misted not with regret, but with release. Behind her, the quiet sound of footsteps passed through the gallery guests, staff, family. No one asked questions, no one needed to. In this room, the story was finally whole. Eleanor lingered just a moment longer, then turned toward the exit, letting her fingers trail lightly along the railing as she walked away. As she reached the threshold, she paused, glanced back once more at the case at the 2 rings, resting side by side in peace, and whispered to the stillness, her voice low and certain, "Some truths take a lifetime to find, but once they bloom, they never fade." The morning light grew stronger, flooding the gallery with gold, and as the camera pulled back, the case remained in view. 2 simple bands gleaming beneath the glass, one once burdened by silence, the other once locked in legacy, now resting together in quiet symmetry. The frame widened, the estate fading into soft light, its story no longer told in shadows but in blossoms, in honesty, in remembrance, a legacy rewritten, and a truth finally seen. If this story moved you, challenged you, or stayed with you even for a moment, we invite you to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Every response fuels our mission to uncover more untold truths and bring stories of courage, justice, and redemption to light. Be sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss a story that just might change how you see the world. And if there's someone in your life who's carrying the weight of silence or waiting for their moment to rise, send this to them, because sometimes the healing begins with one truth spoken out loud. Thank you for being part of this journey.